Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 784, and today is April 11th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot to talk about on today's show, as there just about is every day of the Trump administration. So, going to jump right into it. Just want to remind people to share the show. Is hosted over at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you can find audio podcasts. And of course, follow me on Twitter at KyleLanslone_ for all my work. That's the articles I write, every episode of this show, and of course, the Kyle Anzalone Show. All right, let's get into the news today. First story up here. U.S.-mediated talks have not slowed fighting in Ukraine. I wrote this one for the Institute on April 9th. President Donald Trump has made ending the war in Ukraine a top talking point on the campaign trail and has worked to bring Kiev and Moscow to the table over the first 2 months of his second term. However, the talks have not reduced the fighting on the ground. On Tuesday, the Russian Defense Ministry announced its forces had driven Ukrainian troops from the village of Groevo, located in Russia's Kursk region, which was targeted by a Ukrainian offensive last summer. The village was Ukraine's most significant stronghold remaining in Kursk. Over the past month, Russia has made rapid gains in the region. While Ukrainian forces are being driven from Kursk, President Zelensky said his troops are active in a second Russian border region. He explained, "We continue to carry out operations in the border areas on enemy territory, and this is absolutely just. The war must return to where it came from." So that was a statement Zelensky made on Monday. Ukrainian sources speaking with CNN said that Russian forces had stepped up attacks across the front lines. Moscow claims its troops advanced in a number of regions along the front. Ukrainian soldiers say they are losing territory as they are significantly outnumbered by Russian forces. A representative of Ukraine's 66 separate mechanized brigade told the Kiev Post, "Sometimes there are 10 Russian occupiers for one or more of our infantrymen. The Russians are pressing an incredible amount of infantry, which they simply have a lot of." So the military official explained that in recent months, his brigade has lost 2 battalion-sized units. Along with fighting on the front lines, Kiev and Moscow continue to trade missile and drone attacks. On Wednesday, the Russian Defense Ministry claimed to have hit 150 Ukrainian targets with drones and missiles in a single day. The ministry reported downing over 150 Ukrainian drones over the same period. The increase in fighting comes despite Trump's push to end the war in Ukraine. U.S. mediators have engaged in separate talks with Ukrainian and Russian officials, resulting in agreements to end attacks on energy infrastructure and shipping in the Black Sea. However, Kiev and Moscow have traded accusations of ceasefire violations, and the status of the agreements are now unclear. Russia's ambassador to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, said the Kremlin has remained interested in an agreement with Kiev, but only one that would resolve the conflict permanently. He added that Ukraine must not use any pause in fighting to rearm. So this is the statement that he made. "We are open to meaningful and practical dialogue, but we will not allow anyone to deceive us or to use this negotiation process, directly or indirectly, to enhance the military potential of the Kiev regime. To achieve this, it is essential to address the root causes, one of which is the influx of Western weapons into Ukraine. As we all know, this flow began long before the start of our special military operation and was facilitated under the cover of the Minsk agreements." So, U.S. and Russia are said to engage in another round of talks in Turkey on Thursday. According to the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova, the delegations will be led by the Russian ambassador to the United States and the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Sonata Kotler. So Zakharova said the talks will be focused on removing any obstacles to slowing diplomacy between the U.S. and Russia. And so, look, this is all, I think, particularly interesting as Trump is trying to end this conflict to see the fighting increase. Now, as we mentioned on the show, a lot of times when you are talking about engaging in a ceasefire or cutting or making some deal to end a conflict, both sides really will pour in the military assets because they know that with the pause in fighting, there's going to be time to rearm, regroup, reestablish the front lines. So on that piece, you know, you'll have some time so you could spend a lot of military assets. Additionally, if there's going to be a pause in fighting or a permanent settlement, a lot of times that's going to happen along the line of control. And so if you're able to take some more territory, you may end up with that territory permanently because you spend a lot of resources in the weeds and the muds leading up to the ceasefire or the truce agreement, the final end of the war. And so it's not surprising that we have seen an increase in fighting. I think one of the things that is disappointing is the lack of, it appears, successful diplomacy. That the energy agreement, that the Black Sea Initiative are now not being implemented just fully by both sides. That we haven't had more substantial talks between Russia and Ukraine, I think are bad signs here. And it is possible that something gets turned around and that we start moving in the right direction at a fast pace. But it's also possible that Donald Trump just ends up continuing this proxy war after he is convinced by his advisors and the Ukrainian officials that really the reason we're not moving quickly enough towards peace is Russian President Vladimir Putin. Now, we did have those talks between U.S. and Russian officials in Istanbul on normalizing relations. This one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com on April 10th. U.S. and Russian officials have held talks at the Russian consulate in Istanbul on Thursday that focus on normalizing diplomatic relations. The meeting marked the second round of normalization talks since the first was held in Istanbul on February 27th. According to Russia's TASS news agency, the talks lasted about 5.5 hours. The Russian delegation was headed by their ambassador to the U.S., who, after the meeting, that said good progress was made towards normalizing the work of the two countries' diplomat facilities. The Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Russia and Central Europe led the U.S. delegation. The State Department described the talks as constructive and said the two sides exchanged notes on finalizing an understanding to ensure stability of diplomatic banking for Russian and U.S. bilateral missions. Now, I think one of the problems here is we have our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, running around basically saying the U.S. doesn't want to have talks about talks. And that's essentially what we had here. And so if this isn't progressing fast enough, I think Marco Rubio is going to try to exploit that to say, oh, look, the Russians are dragging their feet, and push Donald Trump to take more aggressive actions against Moscow, which will taint the potential for future diplomacy and, lock Trump into continuing this proxy war. All right, next up here. All right, this is another article from antiwar.com. Poll: majority of American adults have unfavorable view of Israel. So a Pew survey has found that the majority of American adults, 53%, have an unfavorable view of Israel, a figure that has risen in recent years. In March of 2022, Pew conducted a similar poll that found that 42% of American adults viewed Israel unfavorably. The rise in negative view comes in the wake of Hamas's October 7th attack and Israel's unleashing of its genocidal war on the Gaza Strip, which Americans have been able to follow closely on social media. Both polls show that Democrats are more likely to have a negative view of Israel than Republicans. In the new survey, Pew found that 69% of Democrats view Israel unfavorably, with only 37% of Republicans do. However, a negative view of Israel is much more common among younger Republicans. The poll found that 50% of Republicans aged 18 to 49 have a negative view of Israel, while only 23% of Republicans over the age of 50 view Israel unfavorably. The poll found that 52% of American adults have little or no confidence in Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's ability to do the right thing regarding world affairs, while only 32% have confidence in him. The increasing of unfavorable view of Israel among Americans could mean Israel is in trouble when it comes to long-term support from the US, and Israel's military is extremely reliant on the US assistance. And this is something that I've talked about, and one of the reasons that I wonder if Netanyahu and Israel are pushing so hard to move forward with, seizing southern Syria, seizing southern Lebanon, taking and annexing the Gaza Strip and the West Bank right now, because they understand that there is a real end date on the U.S. support for Israel. And this may not come maybe in the next 4 years, but certainly in the next decade or so, as the younger you get. I'm sure a lot of the, people who are going to become 18 in the next 4 or 5 years have witnessed on their social media feeds, and it has become probably a popular and pretty standard opinion among their cohort that what Israel has done in Gaza is entirely unacceptable. And so with that, Israel is going to have more and more trouble in the United States. And look, you could control Congress on 50-50 issues, on 60-40 issues, and probably on issues where it's 2/3 to 1/3, where the American public, 2/3 of us want a particular issue a certain way, and only a third one another way. I'm sure money can buy politicians to have overwhelming consensus for that policy against favorability, even if it's unfavorable, even if only a third of Americans support it. Money can push Congress to have almost unanimous support for a policy. However, if it moves into the, 3/4 of Americans oppose it, 4/5 of Americans oppose it, and you're down to only 10, 15, 20% of Americans who are favorable of Israel, then I think you'll even see a major shift in Congress. And Israel, understanding this, I think is getting all they can from the U.S. now, and they're taking everything they want on the ground right now, because the play is to take everything they can while the U.S. is effectively still on board with Israel. And so I think that's why we see a lot of the policy that we're seeing. Now, while the American people are increasingly distrusting of Israel, our government is increasingly full-on pro-Zionist. Senate confirms Mike Huckabee as U.S. ambassador to Israel. The Senate on Wednesday confirmed former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee as the U.S. ambassador to Israel, putting a staunch supporter of Israel's annexation of the West Bank in the position. Huckabee, a Christian Zionist who believes God gave historic Palestine to the modern state of Israel, was confirmed in a vote of 53 to 46. Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, who is extremely pro-Israel, was the only Democrat to vote in favor of Huckabee's confirmation. Since being nominated, Huckabee has said that Israel's annexation of the West Bank was on the table under the Trump administration. During his Senate confirmation hearing, Huckabee reaffirmed his view that he believes the Palestinian territory belonged to Israel, although he claimed annexation wouldn't be his prerogative. Huckabee refers to the West Bank as Judea and Samaria, a biblical name the state of Israel uses for the Palestinian territory. While visiting an Israeli settlement in the West Bank in 2017, Huckabee claimed the territory was not under Israeli occupation. I think Israel has a title deed to Judea and Samaria. There are certain words I refuse to use. There is no such thing as the West Bank. It's Judea and Samaria. There is no such thing as a settlement. Their communities, their neighborhoods, their cities. There's no such thing as occupation. And of course, he's saying this because he says all this land belongs to Israel. And look, if there was just one Mike Huckabee in the administration, it wouldn't be a problem. The problem is the administration is just filled with people who have Mike Huckabee's position when it comes to Israel. Now, just to get into further how much the current government is willing to destroy America in order to, help Israel, U.S. to screen immigrants' social media for anti-Semitism as part of crackdown on pro-Palestinian speech. So this one again, Dave DeCamp, April 9th, antiwar.com. On Wednesday, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services announced that it would begin screening the social media activity of immigrants for anti-Semitism as a part of Trump's administration's broad crackdown on pro-Palestinian speech. The U.S. CIS, which falls under the Department of Homeland Security, said it would start considering aliens' anti-Semitic activity on social media and physical harassment of Jewish individuals as grounds for denying immigration benefit requests. And so I think this is important because, look, if they wanted to say we're not going to allow immigrants who have expressed anti-American opinions or pro-terrorist positions and want to count any statement in favor of Hamas as that, that's still not in line with the First Amendment, but it kind of made sense under Trump's America First agenda, that it's basically saying we're going to take any criticisms of Israel, and that's what we're going to use to bar people from entering this country. I think it's just a dead giveaway of, again, how much control Israel, Tel Aviv, has over Washington right now. Just how staffed and populated the administration is with Zionists who believe that, Israel has a biblical right to Palestine and that the Israelis could do whatever they want to the Palestinians because that's their homeland, and the Palestinians are effectively just interloping terrorists who are only getting in the way of there being a Jewish state, which there needs to be in order for the second coming of Christ, which is what Huckabee, Hegseth, and others believe. And so this is, really disturbing that we're going to see the First Amendment eroded in this way. We're on one particular issue. Again, this is the issue for me here, is that there's one particular issue, one kind of thought that you're apparently not going to be allowed to have in the United States of America during the Trump administration, and that is thoughts that are negative of Israel. All right, so Israel is expanding its buffer zone in the Gaza Strip and essentially flattening and taking more territory. And with the expanded buffer zone, I believe it's 2 kilometers or 1.2 miles now. The Israeli military is preparing to bring the southern city of Rafah into its buffer zone as established along Gaza's border with Israel. The buffer zone areas, the Israeli military has demolished virtually every building and has destroyed agricultural land to make the area uninhabitable. A Haaretz report said that similar destruction could happen in Rafah, which has been left in ruins already because of Israel attack, but it hasn't been decided yet. The Haaretz report reads, according to defense sources, it is yet to be decided whether the entire area will simply be redesigned designated a buffer zone that has off limits to civilians, as it has in other parts of border areas, or whether the area will be fully cleared of all buildings demolished, effectively wiping out the city of Rafah. And so this has been happening all around the Gaza Strip. Not only do they have the buffer zone around the edge and the Nazarene corridor in the middle, but they're cutting another corridor that's going to be between Khan Yunis and Rafah. I think they're calling it the Morag axis. And so there's just, they're chopping up the Gaza Strip. They're forcing the civilians into a smaller and smaller area, the Al-Mawasi humanitarian area. And the goal is to just make the whole situation so unlivable for the Palestinians that they will all leave or be driven out of the Strip in the coming year or so. All right, next up here, this one I wrote for the Institute on April 10th. Hamas has 75% of tunnels intact, 40,000 fighters, and rocket production facilities. So Israeli media sources speaking to the press revealed the lack of progress Tel Aviv has made towards one of its core goals in Gaza, eliminating Hamas. The armed wing of the Palestinian group reportedly retains 75% of its tunnel network, now has 40,000 fighters, and the ability to produce its own weapons. So according to Haaretz, an Israeli defense official explained Hamas still has significant military capabilities despite 18 months of fighting in the Strip. Israeli media analysts now estimate Hamas has 40,000 fighters. Before October of 2023, Hamas was estimated to have between 20,000 and 30,000 fighters under arms. Near the end of the Joe Biden administration, the U.S. intelligence community estimated that the group had lost 15,000 fighters during the Israeli onslaught, but had recruited the same number of new troops. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has stated one of his top goals in Gaza is to eradicate Hamas. However, the war has decimated the civilian population in Gaza. Most Gazans have been displaced multiple times, at least 50,000 have been killed, and countless deaths of deprivation have been reported. Tel Aviv and Washington maintain that all the fatalities caused by the Israeli war and blockade are the responsibility of Hamas. The Israeli defense officials reported that despite some protests, Hamas retains its popularity and is firmly in charge of Gaza. Its armed wing, the Al-Qassams brigades, still have the capacity to produce arms and rockets. Last week, Hamas fired several rockets into Israel, leaving one person injured. While Hamas has a significant fighting force, Israeli officials said the militants have not been engaging with Israeli troops. Tel Aviv says the fighters are hiding among civilians or in tunnels. Hamas also retains a significant portion of its tunnel network. The officials said that the IDF has only managed to destroy 25% of the group's underground facilities so far. Defense Minister Israel Katz explained some of the tunnels connecting Gaza with Egypt remain intact. And so this, I think, goes to show two really important things. The first is that Hamas, again, remains a significant military force. And that's important to point out that Israel has far from won this war. And even if their plan is the general ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip, we're going to see if that could be accomplished with Hamas having so much infrastructure still in place. Now, the other point I think is it's clear with this that probably Israel's top goal isn't actually the eradication of Hamas. It's just making the situation in the Strip entirely unlivable for everyone. And in fact, in that sense, maybe Hamas presents a useful player on the battlefield in Gaza for Israel, as the more fighters that Hamas has, the more tunnels that Hamas has, the more of an excuse Israel has, the more of a need Israel has when they come begging the United States for more weapons and for more military assistance. So we have all these tunnels to still get rid of. And so those are two really important factors in this, I think. All right, wrapping up the show here today with this article from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Trump advisor Sebastian Gorka pushing for U.S. to escalate war in Somalia. So the Trump administration is divided over how to handle recent battlefield gains in Somalia by al-Shabaab, which has been making advances and threatening the U.S.-backed government's hold on Mogadishu, the New York Times reported on Thursday. The report said that the State Department has proposed closing down the U.S. Embassy in Mogadishu and evacuating U.S. personnel in order to avoid a rushed withdrawal if al-Shabaab does end up taking the city. Other administration officials are pushing for an escalation, including Sebastian Gorka, a media personality who currently serves as director of counterterrorism on the National Security Council. The Times report said that during an interagency meeting, Gorka argued that al-Shabaab taking over Mogadishu would be intolerable and suggested stepping up airstrikes against them, which could mark an escalation of a policy that has failed to achieve any progress. No final decision was made at the meeting, and the administration is still divided over what to do next. Many want to avoid a situation similar to the Afghanistan withdrawal, which involved a rushed evacuation of diplomatic personnel. According to U.S. Africa Command, there are about 500 to 600 U.S. troops in Somalia. Through multiple U.S. administrations, the U.S. has propped up the federal government, which controls little territory inside Somalia's internationally recognized border and appears to be weaker than ever. Somaliland in the northwest has acted as a de facto independent state for decades, and last year the northeastern Puntland region withdrew from the federal system, and the southern Jubaland state ended its cooperation with the federal government following a dispute over elections. According to the Times, there has been reports of federal government troops not being willing to stand and fight against al-Shabaab. President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed is also said to have alienated rival clans and some of his own supporters. President Trump has dramatically ramped up airstrikes in Somalia during his first term, and since returning to office, he has launched several strikes against al-Shabaab and Somalia's ISIS affiliate, which is based in the Puntland region. Hawks who are in favor of intervention in Somalia portray al-Shabaab as a major threat to the U.S. due to its size and al-Qaeda's affiliation, but it's widely believed the group does not have ambitions outside of Somalia, and I think outside of southern Somalia mainly. Al-Shabaab was born out of the U.S.-backed Ethiopian invasion of 2006 that toppled the Islamic Courts Union, a coalition of Muslim groups that briefly held power in Mogadishu after ousting CIA-backed warlords. Al-Shabaab was a radical offshoot of the Islamic Courts Union. The group's first recorded attack was in 2007, and it wasn't until 2012 that Al-Shabaab pledged loyalty to Al-Qaeda after years of fighting the U.S. and its proxies. Now, the last thing I'll add here, in another important factor in all of this, is I think instability in Somalia is going to present an opportunity for Washington and Tel Aviv to offer Mogadishu or Puntland, Somaliland, Jubaland, any of these other areas of Somalia, recognition, arms, support in fighting against ISIS and al-Shabaab in order to trade that for them taking in the Palestinians. And so I think that has to be considered as something potentially going on here. All right, everybody, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. We'll be back with more episodes of Conflicts of Interest Monday, Wednesday, Friday mornings next week. And, of course, the Kyle Anzalone Show Monday and Wednesdays at 4:45 Eastern. We stream that one live. Thanks, everyone.